Well, that's the specialty that we work on at WellFed World, and try to bring some nuance. So there's actually some very tangible impacts that it has. A lot of times people will just use examples that say if the United States were to cut our meat consumption in half, that it would free up enough grains to feed the world's hungry. And it's obviously not that simple, and we want to make sure that if people are using those examples that it's because they're just trying to show it as an example of scale and how much waste is happening globally. But there are some tangible impacts, and one of the ones I focus on a lot is how crop intensive it is to eat animal products. So at the base level, just animals eat much more food than they produce. So we're feeding a lot of crops to animals and really inefficiently cycling those products and to people who are wealthier. And so there's a lot of numbers that if you'll see, if you are into feed conversion ratios for people who are a little more advanced. I'm gonna try to speak both to a more advanced audience and to a newer audience. So at the base level, animals eat much more food than they produce. So it's a waste of food crops to be diverted to livestock. But for those who are a little bit more advanced, who know some of the feed conversion ratios, you'll see that the livestock industry, for example, talks about how a cow will eat 7 pounds of crops to gain a pound of weight. So they say that the feed conversion ratio is 7 to 1, 7 pounds to 1 pound gained. But that's actually a live weight ratio, and the ratio is much higher if you're talking about a carcass weight versus an edible weight. So as the general public, as social justice activists, as researchers, what we really want to focus on is that edible weight. So how much is an animal eating, how many crops are being fed to an animal to produce a pound of edible food? And what that is doing then is removing the bones and the blood and all the parts of the animal that we don't need until it's packaged all nice and neatly and put into the supermarket. And when those numbers are coming out, that's why you'll see a lot of vegetarian activists talking about 16 to 1. Those numbers have been floating around for quite some time, about 16 to 1 for cows, 7 to 1 for pigs, and 2 to 1 for chickens. But those numbers are actually conservative. So we've got some information on our website at AWFW.org. We specifically have a feed ratios drop down that you can look at, and it shows Wacław Szmiels, who's a researcher. He's not a vegetarian vegan. He just does the numbers. And he shows that cows actually come in at a 25 to 1 ratio. So that means that 25 pounds of crops are consumed for 1 pound of edible beef by the time it makes it down to beef. And for pigs, that number's over 9 to 1. And then chickens are about 4.5 to 1. Now for live weight, chickens are more like 2 to 1. And this is one of the really funny things about our focus on food waste. If you were wasting 50% of the world's crops, people are outraged at it. They're like, oh my gosh, we have to fix this. We have to do something about this. The UN Special Rapporteur to the Right of Food said that biofuels was a crime against humanity for crops being diverted. People talking about food waste as crops being lost and reference hunger, but yet we'll celebrate a 2 to 1 loss, a loss of 50% of crops with chickens as being efficient. And they are efficient relative to 7 to 1 or 9 to 1 or 25 to 1. So that's at the really base level, is that we have a massive amount of crops being diverted, but not just the crops. You're also then talking land use, you're talking water, you're talking energy, and some of the tangible impacts that has is where are those crops, the feed crops, coming from? And you'll have low-income countries with high concentrations of hunger in their population actually exporting food, and they're exporting feed crops as well as the animal products, dairy, things of that nature. They will export even though their own people are hungry. And to be clear, they're also exporting things like coffee and cocoa and flowers. That's not just meat products, it's part of a wider system that is broken, but they are exporting a lot of food even though their own people are hungry. Another tangible impact of that is that when you're talking about hunger is pricing. So basic supply and demand shows that if you have a relatively stable supply, the higher demand is, that puts upward pressure on food prices. So when you have livestock competing with the general public, with people who, not even the general public, with the world's poor for basic food supplies, livestock, the companies can actually outbid the people who are the poorest of the poor, because they don't really even have much money at all. So they will outbid. That puts pressure upward on pricing. So if we were not using animals for food, there would be a lot more crops available that could put downward pressure on pricing. Again, I want to be really clear that having a vegan world and not having animal agriculture does not solve world hunger, and that there's a lot more factors in global hunger than just food availability, crop availability. But that is a factor, again, since we are in a price-based system, that can either help hunger or make it worse. So that's a key issue. Also, one of the things coming in is that a lot of factory farms are coming into poor communities. There's a lot of land grabbing that's happening in Africa in particular, and other countries globally. And so what you have are coming in for either crops or to put actual factory farms. And then you're devastating the local communities with the pollution as well. So then they can't grow their food as well because you're polluting their community. So that's exacerbating hunger. The climate impact, which I'm sure we'll get to the climate impact a little bit later, but that is exacerbating hunger because you're going to be lowering crop yields, not just with the floods that come in and the storms and the high profile things that are happening with heat waves and droughts, but just the incremental climate change that's coming in is really having a devastating effect on food yield, and it's expected to get much worse, which is going to amplify hunger even more. So there's lots of ways that that's going on, land use, water shortages. So I know we're going to be getting into more of those aspects, so I'm not going to try to fit it all into this one question, but pricing for sure, and extensive crop use being diverted to livestock instead of feeding people directly is the short answer. Very directly. So we have 70 billion plus land animals alone being reared and slaughtered for animal-based food products right now, and that number is drastically increasing. It was 50 billion in 2000, now it's 70 billion. It's expected to go up to 120 billion by 2050. This is called the Livestock Revolution, this massive increase in animal consumption, and there's a couple key ways. So first off, if we just want to focus on carbon dioxide, carbon emissions, it's very energy intensive. So when we're talking about all those crops being raised, that takes a lot of energy to plow those crops, to grow those crops, a lot of monocultures, fertilizer, that takes a lot of fossil fuels going into it. It takes a lot of energy to process animals and turn them into meat. The slaughter process is very energy intensive. It has to have more refrigeration, more heat to keep it cool, and then to cook it. The animals are transported, so you have live animals being transported long distances to slaughter, and then the transportation of the chopped up meat afterwards going to supermarkets. So from a carbon perspective, there's a lot of energy use involved in the process of raising and killing 70 billion animals every year, almost 10 billion, just over 9 billion, but creeping back up. We were at 10 billion, now coming back up to 10 from 9. In the US alone, so lots and lots of carbon. But one of the things that I focus on a lot is the methane, and some other people focus on methane too, but I don't think it gets quite the attention it should. And there's also something in particular that we like to focus on at a WellFed World. So when it comes to methane, which is predominantly cows, and cows are ruminant animals, so that's why their methane is going to be higher than pigs and chickens if they're fed grass-fed. So a lot of people like to say, oh, grass-fed cows they're eco-friendly, they're helping the environment, and this is the way we can have our meat and eat it too. Sorry, that's not the case. The grass-fed cows, grass-fed beef, is actually much worse on the climate because of the methane production. And so what you have is when they're eating grass, their methane emissions are 3 to 4 times higher in concentration than if they're fed cereal based, which is what happens in factory farms. They're fed from corn and soy and things like that. So from an animal perspective, if I were a cow, I would rather be a grass-fed cow than a factory-farmed cow. As an animal rights person, I would rather animals be treated less bad than more bad. I don't want animals to be used for food at all, but From an animal protection perspective, grass-fed is better, but from a climate perspective, you're getting this massive amount of methane being released, 3 to 4 times more than other animals. And then you're also getting mass deforestation because of the forest being cleared for grazing. Now, if they are not clearing it for grazing, they're going to clear it for animal feed crops to feed factory farm animals. So you're going to have deforestation happening either way. It's either going to be deforested so cows can graze, or it's going to be deforested for feed crops. And right now feed crops are about 1/3 of the world's lands are being used, croplands are being used for, or the 1/3 of the world's crops are being used for feed. So it's an immense amount, and as we just discussed the ratios, you can see why. So the reason that makes a difference for the people who don't follow this as closely is that we need forests to fight greenhouse gases. So most of what we're doing is we are trying to emit less greenhouse gases, fewer greenhouse gases into the air. So that's where our focus often is how can we emit fewer greenhouse gases. Photosynthesis is what actually draws them out of the air. So our best way to actually fight it and to work proactively is to have more trees. We should be reforesting, not deforesting. And so that's another way. If we significantly reduced, or my preference is not use animals for food at all that land that we're using for feed crops and for grazing, we could be reforesting at least some of that. Realistically, it wouldn't be all of it, but we would have the ability to not only not deforest, but to reforest and increase our photosynthetic capabilities and help pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. You're not getting the same kind of photosynthesis that you're getting. If you're having these mature trees up there, they're really getting a lot of photosynthesis. If you're growing corn and wheat and soy that's just chopped down, that you're not getting that same photosynthesis. Just like everything kind of keeps stemming back to the crop-intensive nature of using animals for food. So when you have to grow all those crops, those crops are irrigated. The processes of slaughtering animals are very water intensive. You have to use millions of gallons of water cleaning slaughter plants. You've got to use water to dilute the manure lagoons and just mostly the feed crops though, and the irrigation. And this is going to be increasingly a problem. Water shortages is high on the list of what the UN and other global leaders are really concerned about as affecting future both food scarcity, food security, and just in general, we need water. Well, it affects food shortage in the way we've just been discussing. It's a massive diversion of staple food crops away from people who need them and fed to livestock, and it's a bidding war. You're outbidding the poorest of the poor and exporting it to those who need. So when something happens to increase scarcity, it just becomes that much more intense, and you can see it more like we just saw with the food crisis back in 2008 and 2009. And so it just is more intense and gets a little bit of news coverage, but this is an ongoing problem. Back in the 80s, the Ethiopian famine, they were exporting food, and this is standard operating procedures. You have these countries with high populations of hungry people, whether it's a famine or not, exporting feed or other forms of animal products or other foods while their own people are hungry. And the reason they do this, it's not to be mean necessarily. Sometimes it's a political weapon being used to keep the population down. But basically, the elites within a country, they need to have some kind of foreign exchange. If they want to buy the things they want, whether it's weapons or luxury products or whatever it is they want to buy on the foreign market, they've got to have something to sell. And so a lot of times what that is natural resources and food resources. And so that's why that happens. And it's also, there's many other factors that go in. There's food speculation and things of that nature. So it's not always just that. And when I'm talking about the supply and demand, I want to also go back and clarify that there's other factors that affect supply and demand. And if your supply and demand move together, so increasing demand is not that big of a deal if your supply also increases. And so that's the argument. It's like, well, it doesn't matter that demand's high as long as supply is high enough to match it, then it's not going to affect food prices in the same way. One of the things I want to go back and clarify when we were talking about supply and demand is that if supply and demand can keep pace with each other, it's not going to have that same impact on food prices. So if we have increased demand because we're feeding a lot of crops to livestock, that's not as big of a problem if we have enough supply to keep up with it. And so, but what increasingly we're going to have is that we have constraints on land use, water shortages, and the arable land affects the amount of crops that we can have. So increasingly we're going to have restraints on the supply that we can do. Now, people are going to talk about, well, we've got technology, that we're going to get higher yields, but with climate change in particular coming in with the storms and just the incremental change that's going to be decreasing yields, I think we can pretty much count on that supply at least being steady, if not actually decreasing and causing more of a problem to where the high demand for staple crops is going to be bidding away from the poorest of the poor. And I was talking about with the elite within a culture, so like policymakers, like why would people who are leading a country sell out their own people? And the reason is that they want to have foreign exchange and be able to buy things like luxury items, buy things like weapons and things like that. You have to have something to sell if you're going to have something to buy. And so that's where some of that happens. You basically have an elite alliance within poor countries and more high-income countries, so that, and corporations, so increasingly corporations are their own non-state actors that wield an immense amount of power. Animal products affect species extinction quite a few ways, but I just really briefly say that when we're dealing with the impact on climate is what is really just devastating some ecosystems, and so when you're having that, then you're going to have the extinction problems when you're devastating ecosystems. So there's other ways, there's other people who can speak to that in more detail, but that's the simple answer. If you care about reducing GMOs, stop using animals for food. So GMOs are affecting our food system outside of the livestock industry. GMOs right now are predominantly in corn and soy, which are animal feed. So there's a lot of processed products that are in the system right now that are GMO based, but a lot of it is animal feed. And these massive monocultures being used to feed our livestock populations. Again, we've got almost 10 billion in the US, 9 to 10 billion in the US, 70 billion globally. So all those animals have to be fed, and we're using monocultures, and a lot of them are GMO monocultures to feed the crops. And then also, if you are eating animal products, I just want you to think about that those GMOs are concentrating in the animal's flesh before it gets to you. Same thing with pesticides. People go through all this trouble of buying organic vegetables or washing their vegetables to get the pesticides off. Those pesticides on the vegetables and fruits are just minuscule compared to the pesticides that get built up in animal flesh from the feed. Government's in with big business. The NRA, people think of the NRA as being such a powerful lobby. Animal agriculture, the agricultural lobby, is immense. They wield an extensive power, and not just the lobby, but it's all intertwined within the government systems. You have government checkoff programs that help the livestock industry, and also part of it is that people want to eat meat, right? So that when you have a culture that supports meat eating, then you don't have the kickback from the government as far as, you know, they just think, well, we have to have meat, and this is the most efficient way to raise it. Again, I can make the case that it's not, but that's why they're supporting it. And then again, because there's just so many mutual interests as far as you know, money going back and forth. The USDA, by its own mission, is conflicted. It has a mission to promote health, but it also has it's in its mission to promote livestock products. And support animal agriculture. So when you're that intermixed, there's going to be problems. So getting the subsidies out would be great strides in really having the cost of animal products reflect their true cost and not externalizing them to the consumer in other ways by, you know, again, the taxing system means people aren't paying the true cost for food, so that increases our consumption of it, which increases our healthcare cost. There's so many benefits if we would at least eat less meat. Again, I'm all about eating no meat, no animal products, and vegan diet, but at least plant-friendly policies and recentering away from meat. So if you're not going to be vegan, if you think for whatever reason, is to really reduce, like think of it as a side dish, as a condiment, and to recenter food policy and food choice around plant-based food and farming, because we also don't need animals for farming. There's composting and things. You don't have to eat your food out of manure. A WellFed World is a hunger relief and animal protection organization. We chip away at two of the world's most immense, unnecessary, and unconscionable forms of suffering: the suffering of people hungry from lack of food and the suffering of animals used and abused for food. And what's really special about that to me is, you think of, well, do I have to choose between people and animals? But you don't. The same foods that help animals are the foods that help people, that help the environment. And when I realized that, it just all came together, and I was like, why is this not happening? Why are, like we said earlier, why is the US government and international government, think tanks, but not just the government. I understand why the government, but why aren't the think tanks doing more on this? And they consider meat to be demand driven. So there's a lot of focus that's like, well, it's demand driven, people want it, so we just have to figure out how to deal with that demand. So they'll admit all the environmental destruction, the climate change that's happening, the problems it puts on for global food security currently and in the future, the disparities. They'll acknowledge that, but they won't say reduce consumption because it's unpopular, it's inconvenient. So they'd rather focus on, well, how are we going to fix the problem with technology, or trying to get population growth down, instead of also just focusing, which you can focus on those things, you don't have to not focus, there's problems with both, but also to say, let's reduce our consumption and let's put policies in place to reduce our consumption. So that's one of the things that a WellFed World works on, is really just even getting it on the agenda. So I was talking about in my talk that a lot of times people like to think vegans are sentimental, but really we're the practical ones. We've got the numbers, we've got the science, we're saying, hey, this is why this is important, but it's people who are basically addicted to meat and cheese and eggs that are clinging to it and don't want to give it up despite all these dire consequences. Like, humanity is at stake with climate change. Here's something we can do about it, and people still don't want to do it. And so, just trying to at least get it on the agenda, and then once it's on the agenda, hopefully it'll take a bigger role. So that's one of the things the WellFed World does at the structural level, is trying to bring awareness to this problem for the general public so that we can change our habits individually. For social justice activists, this is really important. It needs to be part of the solution. Environmental organizations, you want to talk about, oh, the government's not doing anything. The researchers aren't talking about it. Even the environmental nonprofits aren't talking about it, and they're advocates. And they don't talk about it because it's unpopular and people don't want to hear it. People would rather, drive less or take short showers. Those are easy. Turning your lights off, that's easy. That's not asking something that's really significant. And, we also get torn as vegan advocates. Should we make it sound hard to go vegan? Should we make it sound easy? It's both. So it does take a little bit of habit change, but once you work through that, especially for those of us in the US, there's a lot of access to dairy alternatives and meat alternatives and egg alternatives. So I was doing it back 20 years ago while I was in grad school. It was much more difficult, and now I can get vegan pizza at 3 locations that's walking distance from my house, and I can get vegan pizza delivered from 3 places also. So there's vegan pudding, there's vegan ice cream. So and this is a health conference that we're at, but there's lots of junk food vegans out there. So we don't have the excuses that either we used to, or just really don't have much excuses at all. And so, but people cling. And I get that too, because, I like ice cream, vegan ice cream, but, when I try to not eat ice cream, I cling to it, and so it's similar. I get the comfort of foods, but this is a matter of life or death. It's directly a matter of life or death when we're talking about the billions of animals that are being killed unnecessarily for food, but it's also a matter of life or death for the 9 billion people who die every year of hunger and hunger-related causes, and that's going to increase with climate change. And then it's also a matter of life and death for our own health, the diseases of affluence, heart disease, cancer, stroke. So there's so many reasons to recenter again our consumption around plants. Even if you don't go all the way vegan, just the more you do, the easier you make it for other folks. So that's a key part of what we do at a WellFed World. But we also do a lot of direct, we do grants to groups on the ground who are doing feeding programs, vegan feeding, vegan farming programs, especially for people in need, especially in low-income countries or low-income communities in the US, and also helping animals on farm sanctuaries. And it's kind of interesting because I'm a little academic leaning myself. Like, I like to focus on the system. We really need to change the system. It's not that people are bad, but we have bad systems that are destructive, and if we can change the system, then people will improve their behaviors with that and their practices with that. But because I think that climate is going to come in and cause such disruptions at the global level, and really in my lifetime can take out a good chunk of us, whether we're actually personally hit by a hurricane or a flood or a drought, it's going to cause massive economic destruction and disruptions on the global level. So it's shifted a little bit because I'm pessimistic about our future, that I want to do more to help people and animals right now to reduce suffering, because I'm a little concerned that it's a lost cause in the long run, that we're going to be learning the hard way. We have the opportunity to change our practices, to start reforesting, to at least give it our best shot to not get so destroyed by the upcoming climate change. But we're not doing it. I think we'll start doing it more as we start feeling more of the natural disaster pressures and food scarcity and water scarcity. But it's, you know, when is it too late? So that's what we do at the WellFed World. But one of the programs I'm really excited about that I want to share is, I don't know when you're watching this, but if it's around holidays time, or it could be any time, birthday time, is that we have a Plants for Hunger campaign. And our website is really easy to navigate. It's AWFW.org, stands for A WellFed World. And it's not big and flashy. I've kept it really simple with easy drop downs, easy to see campaigns versus issues, so you can see the research, so you can see the programs. And the Plants for Hunger one is 4 groups that I've picked because I know that they're so effective. And one is the Ethiopian school lunch program that's vegan. We're working with some folks in India on vegan feeding programs. Guatemala, the group Plenty, has a soy nutrition program. And then our partners in the US who are just outside the Atlanta area are doing vegan feeding and farming programs. And so as an alternative to donating to hunger organizations that either provide meat, so providing dead animals to feed people, or providing live animals like Heifer International, we provide one that supports vegan feeding programs, and we send 100%. So I don't care about pitching this to you. So sometimes I would feel like, oh, donate to us. I don't want to pitch, you know, our organization, but I'll pitch this because we send 100% to these groups, and they're smaller budget groups, so your donation makes a bigger impact, and sometimes we even have a matching grant with it, so it's even multiplied more. So I recommend checking that out when you like to give donations for presents as opposed to physical presence, and you know, you can give the gift of food. Combined with that, we also have information. A lot of folks are really concerned about Heifer International but don't have the research to put with it. They just know they don't like it. And Heifer International has hundreds of millions of dollars. They have amazing propaganda out there showing these cute kids and cute animals. Everybody's happy. But we break it down, so we show, you know, what their budget is, how much they spend on fundraising, the problems with it. A lot of the countries they go to are lactose intolerant. A lot of the countries they go to have land degradation. And if you just want to think even just briefly about the families that are so poor that they can't really feed themselves, how are they going to take care of animals? So those animals have to be fed, they have to be watered. A lot of times children are taken out of school to help care for the animals. I've heard stories about children having to sleep in the barn to protect the animals so somebody wouldn't steal them. So there's a lot of problems with it. And we're not saying if you don't have access to calories, you know, you eat what you have to eat if you don't have other access. But what we're saying is don't automatically assume it has to be meat or it has to be animal based. So there's so many benefits to looking at plants. You can grow much more than you can get with meat, as we were just talking about, without the environmental problems. Growing plants it helps the soil, whereas animals, a lot of times we think that animals are helping the soil, but they're not. They're overgrazing it. So there's a lot of positives to plants and negatives to animals, and we just help draw that out. I also, if we're just on the animal issue, so we've talked a lot about climates and hunger, but we do specifically work on the animal side of the equation as well. We have a website, humanefacts.org, so that's humanefacts.org. And this is really, it's very, again, simple educational website, and it's geared towards people who care about meat, because we know people care. It's not that, again, people are bad. We know people who are buying humane label meat want animals to be treated better, but there's a lot of deception that goes on, and a lot of these big companies are just getting through on these loopholes. Some of the most egregious things that happen on factory farms, as far as castration without any painkillers, tail docking, ear clipping, beak debeaking that goes on, all that happens, again, without painkillers. They can still do a lot of confinement. And so we go through the different labels, say here's what they include, because there are some protections some of them include, here's what they don't include. So it's labels and loopholes, so that you can really get a better understanding of what the different labels mean, and if what you want to do with that. So and then of course we have a better choices section, which eventually says, the best way to help animals and protect animals is to not eat them. When we're talking about government resistance to change, one of the great examples about how resistant there is to change is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the leading global authority on climate change, the head of it just recommended the Meatless Monday campaign. So 1 day a week, go without meat. And you should have seen the backlash against him. I mean, this is from a climate issue, when we just talked earlier about how important it is to reduce meat consumption, ideally eliminate meat consumption when it comes to climate change. And all he did was very modest, promoting Meatless Monday, and there was an immense amount of backlash. And when the government has done stuff like implementing, or hospitals implementing a Meatless Monday, there's been an extreme backlash against that. So there's a lot of power pushing the continued meat consumption.